In case you're a little bit unfamiliar with what the Century Foundation does, we are a nonpartisan think tank based here in New York, and we conduct timely research and policy analysis on a variety of issues. Some of these issues include housing, poverty, and inequality, all of which will help to ground our conversation tonight. As I'm sure most of you know, this is the kickoff event of our summer networking series for young professionals in New York, and we're so excited to have started it with such a great turnout. We do have a few more events like this lined up for the rest of the summer, and we will fill you in more on those a little bit later in the evening. We're excited to have experts engaged in some very exciting on-the-ground work joining us tonight for our discussion on resilient youth and breaking the cycle of poverty. First, we have TCF fellow Stefanie DeLuca. Stefanie is a fellow at the Century Foundation and an associate professor of sociology at Johns Hopkins University. Her work often investigates the way that social context affects the outcomes of disadvantaged young people, primarily in adolescence and at the transition to adulthood. Stefanie is the recipient of a William T. Grant Foundation Scholars Award for her research on housing and the author of the book, Coming of Age in the Other America. We're also happy to be joined by Brooke Richie-Babbage of the Resilience Advocacy Project, also known as RAP. Brooke is the founder and executive director of RAP. She has spent over 12 years as a lawyer and an advocate for children and youth in poverty. In addition to running RAP, Brooke is an adjunct professor, an adjunct assistant professor at the Baruch School of Public Affairs. Prior to founding RAP, Brooke worked as a Skadden Fellow and staff attorney at NCLEJ in New York. She has worked on health access issues at CDFNY, taught the history of social welfare law and policy at Tufts, and consulted for CLASP around anti-poverty and child care policy. Tonight's discussion will be moderated by TCF's own Halley Potter. Halley is a fellow at the Century Foundation, where she researches public policy solutions for addressing educational inequality. Her work focuses on school integration, charter schools, and college admissions. She is co-author with Richard D. Kallenberg of 2 books on diversity in charter schools. Prior to joining the Century Foundation, Halley taught at Two Rivers Public Charter School in Northeast Washington, D.C. Thank you all for agreeing to help shed some light on this important issue, and I'm sure there are going to be a lot of questions, so before anything else, I'm just going to hand it over to you. You already have a mic. Is the lapel thing working?
Let's see. All right, I think that's working. Great. Well, thank you so much, Rachel, and thank you everyone for coming out. I'm so thrilled to be able to moderate a discussion with 2 women who are working in different ways, but towards common goals, really about breaking the cycle of poverty. And one of the things to start that I just want to note that I think is really important about the work that both Brooke and Stefanie are doing is that in different ways, they are both very focused about making sure that the people who are affected by policies are part of the voice and the conversation when we are shaping those policies. And recently, a couple years ago, this came to light, I think, in a really powerful way. In 2014, the House of Representatives was holding a series of hearings on poverty and the social safety net. And they'd had 4 hearings already, and it wasn't until the 5th hearing that someone who was actually living in poverty testified. And the woman who testified, Tiana Gaines Turner, was a child care worker, a mother of 3. She and her husband both held jobs and in low-wage sectors where their family was constantly struggling to make ends meet. And she spoke really eloquently about what that experience was like and used a rallying cry that keeps coming back to me. She said, "Nothing about us without us." And I think whether you're working in policy or if you are working on the ground, if you are working in research, that's something really important to remember, and something that I really admire about the work that Brooke and Stefanie are doing is finding a way to make sure that those voices that are most affected by policies are included in the conversation. So I want to start with hearing a little bit of your own voices and your own stories. So Brooke and Stefanie, I want to ask each of you to describe the work that you do and how you got to that work, why it's important to you.
I don't know how many of you know who Brene Brown is. So when Brene Brown had to answer the same question, she said, I'm a researcher storyteller. So I'm going to steal from Brene Brown and say I'm a researcher storyteller. I'm a sociologist who uses the tools of the social sciences to try to understand the everyday lives of the poor, to try to understand why social problems persist, why some social policies are effective, why others aren't, what social policies we need that we don't have yet. As Halley said, so I use a mixture of methods. I use statistical, econometric work, in addition to longitudinal field work with families in cities around the country to try to really understand what it's like to walk in their shoes and also to share their stories widely. I'm from the south side of Chicago. Is anyone here from Chicago? Nobody? Okay. Well, so the south side is a very racially segregated place to grow up. And I remember thinking there were places where we couldn't go. There were streets that we couldn't turn down. There were just parts of the city we had to avoid. And I always wondered why. What was on the other side of that boundary? What was wrong with those people? And I didn't have any good answers to those questions. My father was a Chicago police officer. And I always remembered wondering, why are the people that he works with and helps, why are they suffering? My mother was a high school dropout and a full-time mom, and I always remember thinking, how did I end up at the University of Chicago? What was that? What happens to people who grow up where I'm from and in other places in Chicago where I can't go? So these are some of the questions that really motivated me from a young age to try to understand. It's hard. When I wake up in the morning, I think, well, how do we reduce human suffering? How do we promote human potential? And I judge the worth of a day based on how much time I spent that day thinking about and working on those things. So it's a little bit about me.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming. Okay. So my name is Brooke, and I guess I would say that I arrived at this work, that everything I've done has really been guided by this idea of resilience. Similarly, my work now is very tied to my own personal story and my upbringing. I grew up in the Midwest, although not Chicago. I grew up in Michigan. And my family experience has really shaped my thoughts about issues, in particular, of poverty and class. Both of my parents grew up very poor, sort of typical or stereotypical U.S. poverty family experiences. And then they, very long story short, found each other and have been married for 50 years and are the only two people in our entire extended family that can say that. They both went to school, college, graduate school, and we've had a really blessed life, my parents, my sister and I. And that was always a little bit confusing to me because everyone else in my family, all of my cousins, my aunts, my uncles, wonderful, lovely people, none of them had a similar experience. And so growing up, I was struck by this question of why do some people make it and others don't? And how do we even define making it? And how could we explain the blessings my family experienced, my immediate family, and also reconcile those with my extended family? And I would actually say that all of my academic and professional endeavors have striven to answer that question. I became a lawyer. I got a master's in public policy, both because I wanted to try to get at how do we identify the elements of resilience, bottle them, and get them into the hands of as many people as possible. And I've always believed that law and policy are really important ways to do that. And that our laws and policies reflect our sort of core values as a society. And if we can impact those, then we can start to sort of filter out good practices. So that's sort of very broadly how I arrived at what I do. My organization tries to translate that into practice. I love the nothing about us without us saying. I started the organization after practicing law for about 8 years, in large part because I was very frustrated about how when we talk to low-income people and vulnerable populations, especially children and young people who I've always worked with, we talk at them, we talk about them, we talk to them, and we don't talk with them. And so the idea of my organization is to really put the power to change laws and policies and community systems in concrete ways directly into the hands of kids. And I think that sense of power and self-efficacy goes to the core of resilience that I've seen in my family and my life.
So you've told a little bit of your own stories, and I know the work that both of you do is based also on the stories of the youth that you study, Stefanie, and the youth that you're working with, Brooke. What do you think is the broader role of storytelling in making policy? It's something that's frequently completely left out of the picture. I'm curious how you think it should be fitting in there.
So a scholar named Peter Maris said in the late 80s, it's curious why so much poverty research never ends up affecting poverty policy. Why is that? And he said, well, it's largely because academics are powerful critics, but weak storytellers. And as some of you I know are graduate students and working in government agencies where you're probably crunching data, the numbers don't always help us connect with what people are about and what it's like to walk in their shoes. And so I think as a social scientist, I can combine the credibility of the science and the rigor of what we do with the moral authority of having been there with the families, the youth, the landlords that are in our many studies, and to be able to not be the teacher, not be the professor, but turn the tables and let my respondents be the teachers, and I'm the student of their lives, right? And so, and being able to share their stories widely is something that sort of really motivates me. And I want to also thank you for helping me make good on the promise that I make to my study participants that I'm going to share their stories widely. Daniel Kahneman is a psychologist who wrote a book called Thinking Fast and Slow. And he argued that people tend to be motivated more by stories, especially sensational, lurid, vivid ones, like the ones that we see on television, on the quick media, the quick turnaround on the news. And so what happens sometimes are the most aggravating, threatening aspects of inner city life, for example, are the ones that are put on the screen over and over again, and give us the idea that the extreme is the norm, that that's what all kids are like in inner city neighborhoods, when in fact the research that we did over a decade in Baltimore showed us that precisely the opposite is true. The youth that are in the house, at school, working, practicing on the football field are hidden from the cameras because they're not on the corners. So it makes for less sensational storytelling. And so what we try to do in our book and our rest of our work is provide a corrective story, a representative of their shared origins without focusing on the few who are delinquent and destabilize things for the many. So I think that the stories can be really powerful ways for people to also understand why the poor do what they do with what they have and what it means to them. So I think it's a really great question to consider.
I don't think it's an accident that both of us talked about how we got to where we are by telling stories, personal stories about our own lives. I think that personal narrative and story, how we tell ourselves about our world, how we explain our experiences to ourselves and others, are really at the core of how change happens, both on a personal level and a system level. And so stories are right at the core of the work that we do with our young people. We start with having them tell us and one another in groups, in community-based groups, their stories about their lives. And as they develop a personal narrative with us over a number of weeks, they are able to identify the issues that are core to them. If we were to go about it by saying, we're going to talk about social justice issues, and we're going to talk about what's happening in your community and how you can be change makers, I've tried that. They disengage, they sort of look and say, oh, okay, that's interesting. It's a little bit like social studies, which is a little bit boring. Which it isn't, and we hope that they change their minds over time. But I think if you go that way, then it feels academic, it feels separate and external. Mm-hmm. If you start with, you tell us what you're seeing and feeling, not how bullying or stop and frisk or dating violence is talked about in the news, you tell us how you are experiencing those things. That's how we learn the nuances of those issues. And from that point, our young people are able to say, and here are the changes we think need to happen in our peer groups and our communities, and at a policy level. So it has to start with their experiences and priorities, and that's how we learn. In my organization, we do both personal transformative work with young people through curriculum-based social justice boot camps, and then we take what we learned through their stories, through their narratives, and we translate that into system level work. So all of our system level advocacy, laws that we've drafted, testimony we've given, it is all directly tied to aggregate stories that we hear from our young people. I think the last thing I'll say about story is issues that we see in the news, things that we are all studying and reading about, they only have meaning if they're tied to people. And the way that we make sense out of the statistics and the issues is to think about the stories. And one of the things we don't do a good enough job at, as you were saying, Stefanie, is having the people who should be giving meaning to the issues be the people telling those stories. And so I think for those of you who are interested in going into policy work, research, advocacy, really challenging yourselves to find ways to have impacted people be the voices, be the ones defining those narratives, I think is hard, but really critical to meaningful change.
So I want to ask you both a question about grit, and I'm actually just curious from the audience here, like by a raise of hands, who's read an article about grit in the past year? Okay, that was about what I expected. So grit is just everywhere now. I feel like it's a really popular topic, but when you break it down, one of the things I think that you see in some of the work that you guys are doing is that grit maybe shows up in ways that isn't being recognized in some of the research that talks about cultivating grit. Are young people actually being gritty all the time? Yeah. Can you talk about how you've seen the role of grit, the way that both is something that is helpful to break the cycle of poverty, and maybe also some of the ways in which a focus on that can be problematic?
So I think that the idea of grit has promise and pitfalls, right? So on the one hand, it gives us a sense that things can change. People can change, right? And a lot of times I think that's it's hard for people to believe that, and it doesn't help us to think about investing in policies if we say nothing's going to work, right? So I think on the one hand, grit gives us a sense that there's potential for change. On the other hand, it's very individually centered, right? And it sort of runs the risk of having us think about blaming the victim. If you're not a gritty kid, why is that, right? So and that goes back to sort of these cultural arguments and blame the victim narratives, these knee-jerk reactions. So we followed the lives of 150 families in Baltimore who hailed from the housing projects that were torn down in the 1990s. We followed these families over a period of about a decade, and their children as they became young adults. And so, we saw that children hailing from these neighborhoods, some of the most toxic in America, right? So toxic that they were torn down. We're dealing with incredible challenges, right? So half the young people in our study had a parent who was incarcerated at some point. Half had a parent who had succumbed to drug or alcohol addiction. 2/3 had one or the other. A third had both. About a third of the young people in our study had seen personally homicide, violent crime, or some victimization. So just to get to the point where they're in high school and finishing high school is a miracle, right? I mean, it's gritty enough, right, just to get to that point. They're enormous accomplishments, given where they're from. And so they bring an incredible amount of potential and resilience to the starting gate. But it's not enough, right? So we see, right, they've done their part. They got the memo that they're supposed to work and go to school. They bring all of this potential to the starting gate. 70% of the young people in our study finished high school compared to 26% of their parents. These huge intergenerational gains, right? But then they're launched into adulthood into predatory for-profit schools, confusing and under-resourced community colleges, exploitative labor market that can't promise consistent part-time hours, let alone a wage where you can afford a 2-bedroom apartment in East Baltimore. So this grit is neutralized and it evaporates. And so the question then is, right, where we have to do our part to bring that, to reward that grit, I think. And then we want to also consider, how do we motivate that grit? What sparks that grit? It doesn't come out of a vacuum. And so we're going to talk about that in a minute.
Yeah. No, I think my personal view is that grit is actually central to moving out of poverty. Well, no, I think grit is actually central to life. I think everyone has to have a certain amount of resilience and grit to navigate the challenges we all face. I think one of the issues that I've seen I've been working as a lawyer for 12 years, but I've been doing child advocacy work since the late 90s, and one of the biggest challenges is that people don't actually say to young people who are navigating these challenges every day, they don't recognize that as grit. It's maybe recognized as a strength, or you did a good job. It's often spoken about as if this person has this sort of unique, interesting way to navigate terrible challenges, instead of looking at what it takes for a lot of our young people to just get to school every day, or just get to a job interview every day, and saying to them, that's an example of grit. What you did today is an example of grit. And in my work, I think what we have tried to do and what we find to be really powerful and create a lasting change in our young people is to say to them, here are all of the ways that you are demonstrating grit, that you already bring resilience to the table. And now let's talk about how we can foster that. Because I think there are absolutely structural things that as a society we should do to sustain grit, and we'll talk a little bit about those. But I think one of the most powerful things that sustains grit in a person is their belief that they are gritty. And that's something that's taken away from a lot of our young people. They don't have that belief about themselves. And so I think that's a really important thing.
So talking about how we actually engender grit, Stefanie, first, can you talk a little bit about this concept that you talk about in your books? You name identity projects, this fact that many of the youth that you followed had projects that they were really passionate about. Explain that concept and the role that that played in their lives.
So I'll tell a brief little story. In 2003, I just moved to Baltimore, and I was working on the Moving to Opportunity Experiment research, which was a housing policy that happened in 5 cities. And we had started a field project to try to understand some of the confusing findings, from the program. And I remember one day I was weaving through some drug deals on East Biddle Street to get to the house of a young man that I was supposed to interview. And at this time, it may be hard to believe, but I was a little bit awkward as an interviewer. I wasn't very comfortable yet, and so I had 30 pages of questions memorized. I was like trying to do my job. I was a new professor, and I was nervous. And interviewing young men, teenage men, was awkward for the whole team. Getting young people to sort of talk. Once you got folks talking at work. And I remember this young man, Juvan, sitting in the kitchen in his house, and it's not going super well until I've been trying to embarrass myself talking about what my life was like as a teenager. Don't do this. It's a mistake. And then we just started talking about music, and that's when things flipped on. It turns out he really liked heavy metal music, and I actually really liked heavy metal music when I was a kid. And that was sort of what my friends and I, who were a little bit nerdier, were really into. We both like Greek mythology, it turned out. And he was really into debate. And as he talked about the things he cared about, he lit up. We really opened up. Connection was starting to happen. And he said to me, if we had gone to high school together, we might have been friends. You're pretty cool for a white girl. And that stayed with me. And I thought, wow, this is really interesting. He's really excited about this stuff. This is what helps him feel like he's not about what's outside of his front door, right? This is something he's about that's different and gives him some sort of definition and flip the switch for him. So and I said, that's interesting, but onto this research about poverty and disadvantage and all the stuff that's wrong in these neighborhoods, right? So 7 years later, we're back in the field and we're seeing over and over again these hobbies, these passions, whether it's art, pigeon coop building, making music in your computer at home with your friends and selling it online, videotaping. Dana had a VCR, her old dad's VCR, was videotaping herself recording her own poetry. And did this over and over and over again. So there was a videotape for years that was built up. It turned out that this wasn't just a throwaway thing, right? It turned out that this was the single biggest predictor in our study of which youth were on track by the time we left them at ages 15 to 24, in school or working. One of the things we argue is these identity projects spark grit. They're a life raft. At the very least, they allow for some sort of integrity, some sort of sense of who you are. At best, they're institutionally supported. Cody was a young man who was part of the Police Explorers League, and he was really into the scenarios, the domestic violence simulations that they did at these conferences. Vicky was building pigeon coops with her dad, and she went to mess with her birds back out in the backyard when she was feeling stressed out and had a bout of anger that was about to come on. It's just these young people were sort of social flypaper, scanning their environments to find anything to be about, whether it was a trip to the morgue. Jasmine did a field trip one day. I don't know exactly how they ended up at, I think, the coroner's office, but it happened. And she said, I saw people working on these dead bodies, and I thought, man, I can do this. And I got really into science after that. I thought I wanted to be a lawyer, but that got gone. Any chance thing, just coming upon something, you build it and they will come, right? I mean, so we saw this really important, these identity projects were really what provided a life raft in the midst of a storm for many young people.
Yeah, I was really excited when I heard about your idea of sort of this idea of identity projects, because it actually goes, so all of the work that RAP does is organized around helping cohorts of young people develop what we call impact projects. And they're actually just identity projects.
There's something going on here.
Yeah, that's right. And so they go through these boot camps, and the culmination of the boot camp is that they work together to create an identity project that responds to whatever the issue is that as a group they've identified in their community through this narrative building and storytelling. And the reason that we have focused on these impact projects as being so central is both because we see the greatest and most lasting personal transformation in going through the process of creating them, and because part of what they are doing is impacting the fabric of their broader community. And we get to say to them, this is something that is meaningful to you. It's about who you are. It comes from you. And look at the impact, the concrete changes that you're seeing in your peers, in your teachers, in your foster care home. We actually have a project at Rikers Island where we're able to say that they've impacted other incarcerated young people, and that's something that detained youth never hear. So this idea of identity projects, of taking something that is meaningful to them and translating it into something that the rest of the world can see, is both exciting and really, really transformative for them. I think, the other thing I'll say about identity projects is that identity is really critical at that age, right? We're intersecting with young people at a time that their identity is being formed, that who they are in the world, what they value, how they want to be seen is being shaped. And these projects, the ability to say, I want to be seen as someone who loves heavy metal or science. We worked with a group of homeless teens to design and launch a health insurance clinic in homeless shelters around the city, where they signed other homeless teens up for health care, so that they could go to the doctor. And for many of them, that was the first time in their lives they'd been to a doctor because they had never had insurance. These were kids that wanted to be seen as community leaders. That shaping of identity, I think, is very critical. And I think finding ways to support identity projects, be they a one-person project or a group project, is also doing the hard work of helping young people who society very often says or shows, or they think they're showing, that they aren't to be invested in.
Right.
I think it goes a long way to say, we see you and the things that you care about matter, and that can hopefully become part of this identity they take with them into other challenges and throughout their lives.
And I think just that as you were saying, right, this the developmental period. We
Yeah.
all remember what it felt like to find something that we wanted to be about, and what it felt like when you didn't know who you were,
Yeah.
right? So that part is this normal developmental stage.
Yep.
But I think that what we argue is that the identity project serves another purpose, which is survival, either both literally and psychologically, and provides sort of the kindling for the future, right? For a future career, the aspirational bridge between an uncertain, difficult present, a difficult present rather, and an uncertain but hoped for future, right? I mean, so I think that connection is a really is key as well.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And Brooke, you brought up the beginnings of this. We need to support these types of projects. For organizations like RAP, what are the types of supports that are most needed in order for that work to thrive and to grow?
The types of organizational supports, or what types of supports should we provide for our young people? Let's talk about both.
I was specifically thinking about organizational supports. How do we try and clone some of this work and bring it to new places?
So we do everything through partnerships and collaboration. And I think that when you are working with young people and trying to connect personal transformation to something that's going to last, we have to do it with community institutions like libraries and health clinics. We work with schools and detention facilities, city council people, state legislators. And when I say partner, the type of support we get from them is we work with them to help them sustain the identity projects or the impact projects that our young people are creating. So some of what any organization needs is financial, right? Obviously. But more of it is really having people in the communities that our young people live in and are working in and are struggling in, be willing to work with us to set up infrastructures that will support young people when they are done with our boot camp or done with our program. So for example, some of our most exciting partnerships are with the city's foster care system. We do a lot of work in group homes with teen moms and young people who are about to age out of foster care. And the type of support we get from them and the type of partnership we have with the city's foster care system is that they allow us to go into their entire system. We do annual trainings of all of their staff, of their leadership. We have a toolkit that we train them on. How do you do youth empowerment work? How do you do youth leadership work? When a group of young people develops an impact project, what will that mean for your staff? What will that mean for the capacity and the resources you will have to allocate organizationally and institutionally to support these young people? And how can we build your capacity as a system to do that? And so that is both about partnership and about what we're getting from them. We're getting buy-in from a broader system. I think that's really critical for organizations like mine that do work with young people and then sort of send the young people out into the world. I think we need both stronger, empowered young people, which we're trying to work on, and then we need these systems that are willing to say, yes, we're there with you, we'll meet you halfway, and we'll let you help us build our capacity to carry the ball when you're done.
So thinking big, I want to ask you guys about some of the policies that we should be supporting to encourage all of this and where we should be making public investments. And I also want to let folks in the audience know that I'm going to be taking audience questions soon, so you can start thinking if you have any questions. But so, Stefanie and Brooke, where should we be investing public money to help encourage these types of activities that can really help break the cycle of poverty? There's so many possibilities. Is it in after-school programs? Is it in job placement, education? What do you think are the highest leverage areas to really focus on?
So I think the first question that comes to mind, right, is everything costs money, and there isn't enough of it to go around. It's going to cost money to help youth at this later period of child adolescence and the transition to adulthood, but it's expensive to ignore them too. It costs society $27 billion a year for youth ages 16 to 25 to not be attached to school or work. Okay, so there's a price tag for that. There's a lot of attention. I think Brooke was mentioning on investing in early childhood, which is important. Right, there's sort of the higher rate of return on these investments. But yet, Belle Sawhill at the Brookings Institution did a paper with Justin Carpolo that showed, well, if you actually invest throughout childhood, it turns out, surprisingly, right, the returns are even higher, and you can close the gap between low SES and high SES kids by about 70 points. 70% in terms of earnings later on. It'll cost, say, maybe $20,000 a youth to invest in, say, 5 periods of childhood. But the earnings returns over $100,000 per child. 2 children in a home, it's $200,000, which is a tenfold increase, a tenfold return on the investment, right? So in some ways, it's a no-brainer, among the no-brainers, right, that we can think about today. So what do we do? I mean, so what can we do tomorrow, right? We could support organizations like Brooks, right? We could decide we're going to actually take our federal education funding and put it back into art and debate and music. Instead of having just one teacher for the county, let's have art teachers in the schools again, right? Philadelphia is a really egregious example of this kind of cutbacks, right? We've invested in reading and math at the expense of some of the things that we know kids actually enjoy. That are at the basis of identity projects and impact projects. So we could start doing that a lot more easily and a lot sooner. But the trick, right, is that it doesn't solve the problem of deeper economic and racial segregation. So there's a trade-off here. So what do we do tomorrow, and what can we do more easily, and what do we do about these deeper, issues in society of neighborhood segregation? So we know Rod Shetty, Larry Katz, and Nathan Hendren released a series of papers last spring based on the same housing policy program that I studied, that we studied for our book, that showed that children who left high poverty neighborhoods and moved to lower poverty neighborhoods ended up earning more. They're more likely to be married, raise their own children in less poor neighborhoods. Huge returns to this kind of investment, which is about breaking boundaries in spaces, school districts, and neighborhoods. Right, so I think part of the dilemma is what do we do in place tomorrow, right, which respects communities and the assets they already have, so people don't have to leave to go to opportunity, right? But then how do we prevent separate and unequal from being reproduced? So I think we can talk more about this in the Q&A or while we're drinking wine, preferably. But I think those are some of the, I see a couple of different ways to go. Do we go big and get out from underneath the legacy of redlining, which we still see today? That's a housing-based, place-based generator of incredible damage and inequality. What we could do tomorrow. Brooke is working with young people right now. And there are different ways to come at this, I think, that we know from the research. We know enough to act is the important key point, too.
I totally agree. I think, one of the most frustrating things about doing this kind of work is that there are so many right answers to that question. When I first graduated from college, I moved to New York to work for Children's Defense Fund. And I knew I wanted to do child poverty work, and they asked me, do you know anything about health insurance? Because at the time, CDF New York was only doing healthcare work. I said, no, but I want to work for you, so I will learn. And so I spent a couple of years knocking on doors and trying to get people to sign up for public health insurance. And what I learned in the process is that if I wanted to do anti-poverty work, intergenerational, breaking generations of poverty work, I had to learn about health. And I had to learn about education. And I had to learn about employment and housing. And that the answer to any question until I die or stop doing this work is, about do you know this aspect of poverty? The answer has to be, I will find out. That everything impacting the children and the young people that I work with is interrelated. And I think therein lies the challenge. So what I have come to come to believe and argue for is that we need an investment in two things. One, infrastructure. We need to really invest in school buildings and books in classrooms and rebuilding brown spaces, the spaces and the places that young people are spending their time. We need health clinics, we need infrastructure. And that the second investment is sort of a little more amorphous, but I think equally powerful, maybe more so. Most of the systems that young people in poverty interact with function in silos. They go over here for healthcare, and over here for education, and over here for employment, and almost nowhere for housing.
Right.
And that those silos make it really difficult for young people whose lives are, where all of these issues are intertwined, to get services, to get help, to have answers to questions. So having policymakers invest in systems for breaking down silos, in processes for working across silos and working together across issues at the policy level, at the decision-making level. I don't know what that looks like, but I think that's where we have to spend some time and energy and resources.
Great. We're going to open the floor to audience questions, and ask you to just raise your hand if you have a question, and our wonderful education intern, Walter, is coming around with a mic.
Hi, so I can stand up. My name is Christy. I would like to hear more about what you just said about policymakers, and I know you said that you don't quite know, but that's really what my question is. It sounds a lot like what you're talking about is the Harlem Children's Zone model, which has sort of been influential, but I would love to hear more about how you guys are working with city agencies or state agencies or whoever, implementers, to make this to push these ideas forward.
Great. And Christy, actually, will you identify yourself where you're coming from, too? I meant to.
I am a graduate of NYU Wagner, and I currently work for HPD as a policy analyst.
Great.
So I love the Harlem Children's Zone. I didn't actually have them in mind when I was speaking. I actually had something more similar to the New York City Children's Cabinet. For any of you guys who do children and youth work, it's a really innovative initiative that's come out of this particular mayoral phase in our city's history. And it is a cabinet. It is a grouping of all of the heads and decision makers of all of the agencies that work with young people. And that in and of itself isn't particularly innovative. What's innovative is that their charge is to do an audit of each of their systems and to map out all of the different ways that young people access their services, and then figure out how they can make those access points simpler, how they can work across all of the different agencies. And that idea is really what I have in mind. This sort of murky, let's sit in a room and not come out until we have systems that work process. And so I think the Children's Cabinet is a great example of policymakers saying, we will take our time and our money, we'll send our staff, we'll allocate resources to essentially redesigning children's services in our city across not health, education, and employment, not within these issues, but across life stages, across issue areas. So I think that's sort of what I have in mind.
I'll just give one example of something I'm working on based on the housing policy that we were talking about earlier. So these really influential studies came out last May from Raj Chetty, Larry Katz, and Nathan Hendren, and now the group is expanded to include Chris Palmer at Berkeley and Rebecca Tosland at Stanford, and me. So I'm part of the research team now that's working with these all economists, and I'm the only non-economist, to try to understand how we could expand housing mobility opportunities in different cities. So we have the Housing Choice Voucher Program, right, which is the biggest program we have to help house the poor. Houses over 2.2 million households per year. It's a deep subsidy, and it's time unlimited. And right now, 80% of housing choice voucher holders live in moderate to high poverty neighborhoods. So we've got a real lost opportunity here when we look at the research over the last 30 years, which has compellingly converged on the fact that it's not just the family you're born into, it's the neighborhood you grow up in that determines your fate. So we have about 15 public housing authorities, and we're working with HUD. If the housing authorities have expressed interest in working with us to experiment on site with different kinds of interventions to improve the way that they use their housing subsidies, whether it's project-based vouchers or housing choice vouchers. They're sort of working within their organizations to try to give us their practice-based wisdom as well. So that's a really exciting multi-site partnership. Right now, HUD is, for the first time in a while, very committed to expanding housing mobility. And so it's been a really exciting time to work with these groups. And my team at Hopkins has also been doing some advising around what to do about landlords who don't want to take vouchers. Because it's legal in all but about a dozen states to turn voucher holders down and say, I don't want to rent you. It's perfectly legal to do that almost everywhere. That has huge impacts on where families look for housing.
And the viability of the program.
And the total viability of the program. So this is a couple of examples, of, at least from the research world, like what we're trying to do to work with policymakers and also staff at these organizations, which usually get ignored in the research.
Great.
Hi, my name's Amanda. I'm from here in New York. And what else did you want me to say? I'm sorry, I've forgotten.
Your question.
Okay, so my question. So, real talk, I have 3 friends that are on my mind. They're my main reason for coming here. Policy is great and all, and thank you for your work. But 2 of them are intergenerational poverty, in poverty. 2 out of the 3 are also homeless, and one is like right there on the verge of being homeless. So for an everyday ordinary person like me, what do I do to help them and all the other people that I'm going to see on the subways and this, that, and the other here in New York City?
That's an excellent question. So I'm going to start off by saying I'm not going to have the best answer, but I have an answer that I believe. I think that the best thing to do, there are really incredible resources in this city. And that's something we actually try to tell our young people and our partners. A lot of times people hear, oh, there's not enough this. They're actually, New York City is a tremendously resourced place. The challenge is it's very difficult as an everyday person to find those resources. Homelessness is a particularly challenging problem because there just aren't enough beds, and that's a funding problem and a policy problem. But in the immediate sort of future, there are organizations that, especially for people who are right on the verge of becoming homeless, can literally say, I will give you a place to sleep for the next 3 months. I think at the same time that you solve that immediate problem, connecting either yourself, if this is an issue that you're really passionate about, and or your friends, to organizations that can help them develop sort of longer term plans for housing. Again, really challenging right now because it's very limited. There are advocates and people who will spend every day with them to help them figure that out. And I'm very happy and would love to help when we're done with this to connect you to those resources.
Hello, my name's Sydney Paige Patterson. I'm from Gary, Indiana, and I got excited to hear some people from the Midwest. A few, far between in my experience here. But my question, I work at High Leadership Charter School in the Bronx, and my question was, what happens to the youth after the impact identity projects, and what have they gone on to do post those projects?
So I'll just talk really briefly about the young people we followed in our study, and we left them at around age 25. So of the high school graduates, which was most of the youth, about 70% went on to some kind of post-secondary education, but the most common pathway to post-secondary education for these youth were for-profit trade and technical schools. A few went to community college. We had, of 150 youth, about 17 enrolled in four-year college in general, most to some of the local HBCUs in Baltimore. So I think, I could talk a lot more about this, when we mingle, but I think that what we noticed was the lack of information was staggering. I guess I expected that the college for all push would have been everywhere. And it was in abstract, right, in theory. But youth had such information poverty on top of regular poverty about what the trade-offs were between trying to go to a four-year school versus community college versus a trade school. And the heartbreaking thing about this, right, are these young adults are eager to launch. They're trying to do the right thing, and they see a commercial that has it's a trade school commercial showing people in a dentist's office doing things. Showing people in professional settings doing concrete things that they can see and imagine, and then they find out it's 18 months or only just under 2 years. And as one young woman, Crystal, says, well, why wait for years to become something when you can become something in a year at a trade school? Right, so, but there's a rub, and as many of you know, in the work of the Century Foundation, there's been several reports on the predatory nature of some of these for-profit schools. But there, but even if these schools worked well, and we can talk about ways in which they don't, the net price of these schools for a given year could range from $10,000 to $25,000 for kids from a household that's $0 to $30,000. That's the same as the tuition in the first 3 years at the University of Maryland. The University of Maryland graduates 85% of its students in 6 years and has loan default rates that are far below even 10%. Most for-profit schools graduate 40%, 50%, and what we found, and many of the young people did not even finish these programs, in part because they discovered too late they weren't interested in blood, but they were signed up for a certified nursing assistant program. The structure of these schools required them to commit before they had a chance to explore, which is a huge structural disadvantage in comparison to middle class and other peers who did go on to four-year schools who could change majors. Right, and at the for-profit schools, you can't exchange credits, right? You've already paid the tuition, it's over. You have to switch schools or programs, and many young people did this over and over again. They didn't quit, right, but they sure didn't get credentials, and they ended up with debt. So we saw that. We saw some go right into the labor market, and that's not a pretty story either. But I think one really interesting thing was this lack of information about the benefits and costs of post-secondary options in the area.
One very quick thing I'll add is that another, I think, really exciting trend that we see with our young people is a sustained commitment to sort of civic and community engagement, which is a little more amorphous, but in addition to impacts on things like education and employment, there's just this sort of, this awakening of interest in the world and in issues. And so we see a lot of them stay involved very often as activists and organizers in their lives.
That's great.
Yeah.
Follow-up question for both of you on that. Talking about tracking outcomes of students, we actually haven't talked specifically, both in your research, Stefanie, about how you were able to have that longitudinal data on families and sort of when that work started. And Brooke, what does RAP do to stay in touch with the growing network of alumni?
I'll say it's very hard, and we fail more often than we succeed. We actually worked with Wagner School to develop a set of evaluation tracking tools. I'd say up until about 2.5 years ago, we hadn't cracked the nut of staying connected to our young people beyond, say, 3 months after our program. And really, to see the kinds of changes we're trying to see, we need to at least hit 9 months, really, ideally 3 to 4 years. We're getting closer to that, but I would say it's in less than 60% of our kids are we really able to stay connected. And part of that is, as wonderful and transformative as our programs are, the reality of these young people's lives is that they are very often transitory. And so the email that they have or the phone number that they have, the shelter that they're in is just going to be totally different 6 months from now. And so what we're working to do, in addition to having, I think, a fairly robust evaluation tracking system, is develop more, for lack of a better word, personal ways of staying in touch. So it's both about tracking and about relying on and leveraging the relationship that they build with our organization to stay in touch, because friends stay in touch with friends, right? Subjects don't very often stay in touch with their, I don't know what the other word would be. It's harder to keep in touch if you don't feel connected. So that's what we're working towards.
So we do a couple sort of practical things. You know, one thing we do is this is for the field work, sort of the in-depth work we do in homes. We get contact information for 3 or 4 people that will, so we say, always know where you are. So that's one thing we do. We do little things like we'll send out thank you cards, Christmas cards, magnets with the name of the study on that you can put on the refrigerator. So, you know, if there's something that comes up that you want to tell me about, call me anytime. You know, so a lot of the work we do is in recruitment. You know, if we do, often we'll do, you know, once a year. Sometimes we do more frequent ethnography, and that's a little bit easier to keep in touch. But we're outdoor knocking. We're knocking on the doors of neighbors. You know, this gets interesting from the students' training point of view. Getting over that is interesting. So those are some of the practical things we do. For some of the outcome data, you can use administrative data, obviously, if you have the right protocol in place for confidentiality. But I just think, you know, following on to what Brooke just said, you know, when we originally recruit people and, you know, we say, oh, we would love for you to be part of our housing and neighborhood study or a family dynamic study, you know, we pitch it in this really exciting way, right? And the students, I think, just overwhelm people at their front door and they're like, okay. But after we're there for that first visit, and we sit there, you know, or we hang out, we do, you know, wherever they're most comfortable, and you spend anywhere from an hour and a half to 3 hours, 4 hours, 5 hours with someone. You come back the next day to finish up, and you've got a person across from you who says, I want to know everything about you, and I have nothing more important to do than listen. And that experience is sacred, transformative, it's powerful, it's a gift. It's a turning on the table, like I said earlier, of the relationship between researcher and subject, right? We think of participants and respondents, and they end up having, it's very emotional. You know, it's the young people in our book almost never had anybody say, tell me about Antonio. Who's Antonio? And there's no obligation to ask me questions or be nice. It's all about you. So that's a really, I think, powerful experience. It's a gift. It goes both ways. And sometimes people have said, this is better than working with my social worker, you know. And so the next time around, people remember you, and they're like, oh, that was fun. Sometimes we also bring cookies.
That's always helpful.
And then we have to cut off contact at some point. When we worked with the data from HUD, they didn't allow us to just keep contacting people because of respondent burden. But a few of the young people from the book have continued to stay in touch with us through Facebook, and I'm regularly in contact with a few of the young people, and have, you know, I get updates monthly, and we see each other, and so it's sort of an interesting set of dilemmas about how far you can go with that before, you know, it's hard for you to maintain, and also, you know, where the boundaries are, and so anyway, but it's definitely hard work.
It's a challenge, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question before we start our mingling.
Hi, my name is Rosna, and I am a policy and advocacy associate with Hunger Free NYC. And I guess my question is kind of related to what you guys were just talking about, and it's kind of a twofold question as well. You know, I definitely identify with the power of storytelling, especially in doing policy and advocacy work. But one thing that I found challenging, because some of the work that I do is based around civic engagement trainings with the people that we work with, is establishing that trust to be able to have somebody share that story with you. And then also, upon that, how do you get somebody or empower somebody to publicly share their story, to break the mainstream mold or the mainstream identity of what it is to live in poverty and all of this stuff, you know, like,
I mean, one thing that frustrates me a lot with mainstream media, in particular in news, is anytime a discussion of poverty is had, it's always like policy experts and stuff. It's rarely somebody that's experiencing it. So that work is very crucial and important and needs to be done.
So I think that the trust question is really important because I think that's how you avoid exploiting people's stories, which, you know, for the young people that I work with, and I saw this when I was practicing law because we would do class action litigation, and so you collect stories to bring to a judge, and there's this tension between needing somebody to tell you their story so you can use it, and genuinely having that story guide the work. And part of why I started my organization is because I tend to fall more on the B side. I think the way that we do it is we have to create time. Trust is built. And so it doesn't necessarily have to be, you know, it's 5 years, but I think showing up at somebody's door and saying, you've got 30 minutes, tell me your story. I mean, what would any of us do? We'd say, this is a little bit scary, I don't know who you are, how you're gonna use it, and we wouldn't share. So even a few hours, right? And creating a space that that person knows is dedicated to their story. I think the second really concrete thing is being very upfront and frank about how you're going to use the story and having as much of an opportunity for that person to help direct how the story is used. So starting the conversation by saying, you know, here's why I'm asking, here's how this is going to be used, do you have thoughts or questions? It's very important. And then the third, to address the second part of your question, I think that there's a lot of work to be done with media. And we spend a lot of time training, you know, I would train my clients, I train my young people on how to tell their stories, how to be succinct. I think we also need to do some of the training and have some of those conversations with the people asking the questions, with the media. Because those stories are going to be co-opted as long as we live in this sort of Twitter-centric, Gawker, well now Gawker's gone, you know, Gawker world. I think focusing on, there's a really great organization called Solutions Journalism, which I love, and one of the things they do is elevate and celebrate examples of journalism that address really tough issues through empowering and positive lenses, and they do trainings for journalists and media and organizations working with journalists and media about how to move more in a positive or at least affirming direction.
So just to quickly follow up on that, it's a great question. And I think that, you know, as social scientists, we enjoy this kind of privileged place where we aren't under the gun necessarily for 24-hour turnaround. They're rarely sociological research emergencies. There are social emergencies, but you know, so we're rarely under the gun for that, and you know, and the standard of evidence in our field, right, allows us to look at the whole picture. So it hedges somewhat against the concern of, you know, exploiting stories or cherry picking stories. You know, so there's, I think there's you know, there's an advantage there to be sure, and we, you know, rarely do any of the young people, parents, or even the landlords that we study or talk to ask, what are you going to do with this? Once in a great while. I mean, one young woman in Mobile asked, you know, what y'all study about? What are you going to do with it? And that's when I said to her, well, we don't have the money and the resources to change things as researchers, but I promise that I will share your story with as many people as I possibly can, and I will dedicate as much of my time to that as I can. You know, and I will talk to the media about your story. I'll make your sometimes like just too quiet voice a lot louder. And you know, and there's a genuineness, the way we train our graduate students and our undergraduate students about, you know, empathy, lack of judgment, and you know, the sort of the preciousness of the endeavor really helps a lot, and people can feel that in the field work. The last thing I want to say about the story thing, you know, relates to your point on media, and I think, right, there's a trade-off here because there's some journalists doing incredible, groundbreaking work every single day. But you know, but the rapidity of the turnover, I think, right, compromises the quality of the work and the conclusions that are drawn. And I think it's important for let's say the unacquainted person who doesn't spend time with poor people or in poor neighborhoods, who doesn't really know what it's like, right, to find out what it's like. Because I think one of the problems is getting political will and support for public policies. You know, why would you want to have money spent on somebody else's child? Right, so there's sort of a zero-sum game mentality that infects our public discourse and our public policy. So how do we convince people that that those kids are our kids too? Yeah. Right? How do we do that so that we can create more inclusive policies? And also, right, I think change the cost-benefit calculus, because obviously, right, when those kids lose, we all lose. Right, there are costs to segregation, there are costs to inequality. They're measurable, they're big, they're real, and I think, you know, being able to do, you know, great work on the ground, you know, and trying to do high-quality research, and I think shifting the message, you know, is really key, because we rarely think about the quality of the information we get. We're too busy. Right, so Kahneman, again, to quote him, calls this denominator neglect, which is a term I wish that I had come up with, personally, where we don't think, wow, does this one story I'm being told on the news represent a lot of stories? Right. We just take it and run with it, and we don't think, where did that information come from, right? So a lot of the work that all of you in the room are doing, can really contribute to higher quality stories, I think, so that feels like there's less of a separation between other kids and our kids.
I just want to say one thing.
Yep.
I know we're also. I just want to say, I think what you said about empathy is really critical. And I think it's a great point to end on, that we started with stories and really ending with this idea of any change, ending poverty, ending violence, is really about helping people see that your kids are my kids. And in order to see that, we have to nurture and find ways to facilitate and support empathy. That there's something about all of our lives that we have in common. And if the media, if advocates, if researchers, and I think your books do a great job of doing this, if you can say, look, here's the thing that we as humans have in common, then irrespective of where you sit on the policy sort of sliding scale, it'll start to be easier to make decisions that affect everybody positively. And I think that's our challenge structurally, is really nurturing that empathy.
Well, I can think of one good way to nurture empathy and share stories and have many different voices involved. Collaboration. So I would ask you all first to join me in thanking Stefanie and Brooke for joining us. And second, I ask you, if you can, to stay to get a drink, and I'll turn it over to Anna for some
So thank you so much for a fantastic discussion. My name is Anna Vermut. I'm the foreign policy intern here at Century Foundation.
My name is Maya Miller, and I'm the editorial intern here.
And thank you everyone so much for coming out tonight. Before you start lining up for your rounds of wine and cheese, I just want to remind you that we have 2 more networking events this summer. The first is coming up on June 29th, and it's about the changing economy and what graduates need to know as they start their careers. And the last event of the summer is on July 13th, and it will be about the high costs of college. So to learn more about those events and to RSVP, since we very much hope to see you back for those events, please go to our website, which is tcf.org.